Hi, I'm Christy with UT Southwestern. We're here today with Dr. Alice Holland. She's a board-certified neuropsychologist with the Neuropsychologist Service at Children's Medical Center and assistant professor of psychiatry at UT Southwestern. Dr. Holland has extensive experience in psychological and neuropsychological assessment of medically complex children and neurodevelopmental disorders such as ADHD, autism, and learning abilities. As usual, don't forget to like and share the conversation and share your questions in the comment section of this stream. We'll be taking questions throughout this discussion, but we cannot talk about specific cases. So with that, we will begin. So the World Health Organization just recently came out with some new guidelines around screen time for children. Can you just tell us a little bit about that to start off?
Yeah, so in April they released guidelines indicating that basically their recommendation is that children under the age of 2 not have any screen time exposure at all. Children ages 2 to 4 should have no more than 1 hour a day. That's kind of the core of it. A lot of the recommendations also talked about physical activity and getting kids outside and active.
So what was the main reason for those recommendations?
Well, so the American Academy of Pediatrics has long put out recommendations. Over the years, they've changed slightly, especially in 2016. They made significant changes to those recommendations. I think the World Health Organization is kind of chiming in on the conversation now as more research is coming out.
What is research showing?
So there's still a lot to learn, right? Because kids who are growing up today with screen exposure in a sort of omnipresent sense that other generations haven't experienced before, we haven't seen them fully mature and develop. But we're looking at, correlational studies at this point. So we're looking at amount of screen time exposure and academic performance and attention disorders and things like that. And the trends are a little bit concerning. So that's, where some of this is coming from.
Okay, so when you say concerning, what are some of those trends?
So, in general, more screen time has been associated with worse academic performance, higher rates of attention disorders, elevated rates of obesity, all sorts of physical and cognitive issues associated with that.
So as far as, learning goes, what does it do to a child's, learning capacity as they go through their childhood if they start having screen time earlier?
So what we think about when we think about the effects of screen time on development is primarily what it's taking away. So when a child is looking at a screen, they're not engaging in the types of learning that we take for granted. So we take for granted that you and I can sit here and communicate. But young children are learning those skills. They learn through interaction with others. And when they're looking at a screen, they're not experiencing language, they're not experiencing social interaction, nonverbal communication, all those sorts of aspects. So at a very basic level, we're looking at language and communication skills. Then that correlates to things like reading. If a kid's playing an iPad game instead of reading a book, they're not practicing and developing those reading skills either. So things like that can really be affected just by screen time taking up time in a kid's day that could be used on other educational and developmental opportunities.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, we do have our first question here. It's from Kristen. She wants to know, is there an ideal age to introduce children to screens?
So what I typically recommend to parents is that you want to hold off as long as possible. Screens are inevitable in our world, and so, obviously at some point children are going to have screens. But the longer you can hold that off, the better. The World Health Organization says wait until at least 2 years of age. I would say go as far beyond that as you can. We were talking earlier before we started filming, if you have a child, throwing a fit at a restaurant, needing some sort of occupation, if they've experienced having an iPad, they're going to want the iPad because the iPad is much more stimulating and engaging than reading a book or coloring, for example. But if a child has never had that iPad, that child could be calmed down and appeased through giving them a book, giving them coloring, things like that. So it's just easier as a parent to put off that screen time as long as possible.
So, I even see this, at restaurants and with people my age, which Carter has a question now that kind of relates to that. She says, should adults be limiting their screen time?
So definitely, if you're a parent, this is something to consider because kids look at what we do. And there have been studies that show that children who observe their parents reading more frequently end up being stronger readers. So the best we can do to set a good example for our kids, that's a powerful thing. We don't realize how much kids are watching us. They really are. But in general, as adults, there's good reason to limit screen time as well. One issue being sleep. So I think we're all guilty of watching TV at night and being on the internet till late in the evening. But what that does is it messes with our circadian rhythms. So the blue light, the blue wavelengths from screens can trick our brain into staying awake longer than it should. And that makes it harder to go to sleep, that disrupts sleep. So there's lots of reasons, both, in terms of just quality of life, but also quality of sleep and brain health in general.
Is there any science behind, say, reading off a Kindle or off an iPad versus reading physical pages of a book?
So, you just want to make sure that the screen, if you are reading off a screen like a Kindle, there are versions of the Kindle and apps you can put on your iPad or your iPhone that reduce the amount of blue wavelength light. And that has been shown to be less stimulating to the brain, less of an impact on sleep.
Is all screen time detrimental?
So when I get that question, there's two things to think about. So, content is one thing to think about, right? So obviously, for a child, Sesame Street is going to be better than a violent video game. That's an extreme example. So, thinking about, what's better screen time, certainly content plays a role. But when you ask, is screen time detrimental in general, again, it goes back to what we were talking about what it takes away. So even a child watching Sesame Street is not getting those developmental experiences, language, communication, also just self-regulation. So a child who is, just having to sit and entertain themselves or occupy themselves in the car, that's an important cognitive skill. Children need to be able to self-regulate attention, be able to tolerate boredom. This is core to being in school, right? So this is school success. Not everything in school is going to be super engaging for kids. They need to develop that skill of being able to tolerate that boredom and things that aren't as, visually captivating and interesting all the time.
All right, well, we have a question from Roxandra. I hope I said your name correctly. She's asking, the schools are encouraging screen time by giving online homework on the computer or apps. What would you recommend as a max time per day for an elementary kid?
So in general, I recommend about 1 hour a day of screen time that's in excess of what they're required to do. I understand that some schools are requiring things online, and sometimes you just can't get around that. Obviously, you want the child to kind of just get through it as best they can. If there's work they can do off screen, then they can enter their answers on screen, that's best. But in general, going back to those World Health Organization and the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines, they do recommend for ages 2 to 5, and then even beyond that, 1 hour is a good benchmark.
We have a couple questions related to that. We have one from Heather and a related question from Kristen. But the question is, Heather says, I have a hard time trying to balance fun screen time with the screen time the schools require for homework. And Kristen's asking, if kids are on screens at school, do they need to stay screen-free at home?
So you want to consider, first of all, what they're required to do. If they're required to be on screens at school, there's, again, like I said, not much you can do to get around that. But I would minimize screens as much as possible outside of school. So in terms of balancing, I think was the question fun screen time or?
Yeah, fun screen time versus school screen time, I guess.
Yeah, if kids are getting a lot of screen time exposure at school, I would really try to give them fun in other ways. So, activities like arts and crafts, playing outside, sports, get them engaged in things that take them away from that screen environment.
So I guess I have a question kind of related to this. Parents, have been giving their kids screens, say, for the last 5 years, say their kid's 5.
Mm-hmm.
How can they maybe undo some of the damage, so to speak, of maybe giving their kids too much screen time?
Mm-hmm. I mean,
not that they've done damage to their children.
Sure. No, it's hard to dial back, right? So I see this a lot at children's, kids who are some in the oncology department, and kids who are in the hospital for long periods of time. Often there's a TV in the room and there's an iPad, available for them to just pass the time because it's an awful experience. And so then parents have a hard time dialing back from that, right? It's important to do that gradually, but also to sit down and have a conversation with your child. If they're 5 years old, explaining it in language they can understand, but saying, look, we had a period of time where we had a lot of screens, but we're needing to step back on that because you're older now, and appeal to their sense of wanting to be mature, thinking about, we can do other things now. I would be really consistent with rules. You want to set really clear expectations. Using things like timers even, to say, okay, our hour of fun screen time today is up, timer went off, now we've got other activities to engage in. You want to be really consistent, and also, just understanding that if you have exposed your child to screens a lot, it's going to be a process of gradually scaling that back.
Okay, well, we've had some great questions so far. We do have about 10 minutes left, so now would be a great time to submit questions if you have any. I have another question for you. I guess, so for kids, can they become addicted to screens as well? I know that it's actually become a phenomenon for adults, mm-hmm. but is that also an issue in children?
Yeah, for a child's brain or an adult's brain, the brain is just naturally stimulated by light and motion and colors and everything we see on a screen. It's just naturally, it draws the brain in. What I talk to parents about in terms of how this affects a child's brain is they talk about, well, my child can focus on the screen for hours and hours, and it just seems like it's really engaging for them. It is, but it's engaging in a way that doesn't require a lot of active cognitive engagement on the child's part. So the child doesn't have to work very hard. They don't have to, really focus their mind to pay attention to that for a long period of time. So when a child's having that experience, and this is pretty true for adults as well, we become less, our brains become less practiced at regulating attention when things aren't that naturally stimulating. So this goes back to what I was talking about in terms of school. School is not a bunch of flashing lights and colors. Our jobs are not flashing lights and colors. So we have to have that ability, whether it's children in school, whether it's adults at work, wherever we are, we have to have that ability to really train our brain to focus and stay engaged in things that aren't just naturally captivating. And there is research to show that, adults who have more screen time do end up having shorter attention spans for things that are less engaging.
So you mentioned it affects our attention spans. Kristen's asking, does screen time mess with our social abilities?
Yes, so definitely as young children especially. Screen time takes away from nonverbal communication and practicing that, practicing reading facial expressions, practicing reading body language. So all those aspects, in terms of not just social language, but the whole social interactive experience is affected by that. And it goes back to what I was saying, kids are learning that through everyday interactions and practice. And the more time they're focused on a screen and zoned out of the world, the less time they're engaging in that sort of practice.
So Roxandra has another question. She asks, How do you combat computer and mobile game addiction in kids and adults?
It can be a real issue. And in some cases, I know that I've had patients who've had success, working with actual addiction specialists if it's really, really severe. If it's not at that level, the thing you want to do is, again, just set firm limits, right? And again, talking about scaling back gradually, you want to just gradually reduce the amount of time being spent, find other activities, taking away something that's that engaging and enjoyable for a child. You want to replace it with, sports or something to keep them active and engaged. So it's a gradual process. It's a really tough question to deal with.
Do you see patients for that?
Not as the primary question, but it comes up a lot because screens are so present.
Okay. We have a question from Sarah now, and she's asking, as a college student, I spend most of my time on my laptop or cell phone for hours at a time. What are some ways to not let it alter my sleep too much?
So, I think in general, you want to try to do as much of your screen time as possible, at least stopping about 2 hours before you go to bed to give your brain time to kind of wind down. If that's not possible, I understand, college, there's only so many hours a day, and you have a lot of work, and sometimes you do have to work right up till the time when you need to go to bed. In which case, I would look into the apps that can reduce that blue wavelength light so that your computer screen is giving out less blue wavelength, your phone, the same thing. There's apps that you can install to help with that.
Do you usually recommend that for parents that are giving screen time to their children as well?
Yes, and actually for children, I would recommend an even stricter cutoff in terms of how many hours before bedtime, depending on what's reasonable for the child's schedule. Obviously some high school students have really busy schedules too, but at least 2 hours is kind of the minimum is what I would recommend, and as more time you can have between when you're using screens and then when you cut that off and start getting ready for bed and letting your brain wind down, the more time you have there, the better. So definitely recommending that for parents too.
I know you and I kind of talked about this before we started our chat, but schools are kind of saying we want more technology so that way kids are prepared for the workplace and things like that. Do you think that there's any downside to limiting screen time in that sense, I guess?
In a school setting?
Yeah, and just, as far as learning goes, do you think that there's any downside to limiting screen time?
Yeah, I think a lot of schools are eager to kind of be on the forefront of technology and innovation, which I understand. At the same time, we have to recognize that kids, and anyone with a child who has had an iPad in their hands knows this. Kids pick up on technology very quickly. It's designed to be very intuitive even for adults, but kids, man, you can put an iPad in front of a kid and they figured it out in like 5 minutes, even if they've never seen it before, right? So I wouldn't worry too much, if parents are thinking about, I'm looking at 2 schools and one of them does a lot more technology and I don't want my kid to be behind. I wouldn't let that be the deciding factor in a school, because kids at any age are going to be able to catch up and grasp technology and develop those skills.
Okay, we have another question. How does screen time affect children's brains?
So in terms of, development, we look at language and communication, which we've talked about. We look at attention in terms of, being able to self-regulate attention in a boring, less stimulating environment than screens. We look at things like social skills. There's all these areas. We look at reading, development of academic skills. It's a pretty broad impact because a screen, so for example, a child that learns the alphabet from an iPad, they may learn the alphabet from an iPad perfectly well, but relative to a child that learns the alphabet from interacting with someone in a real world setting, that child that's learning in the real world setting is getting additional learning too that you're not even really thinking about, but they're practicing communication, they're practicing focus and attention, self-regulation, even emotional maturity and things like that. So the additional benefits of learning in a more traditional setting are what you're not noticing, like when you're saying, well, my kid learned the alphabet fine from an iPad, but there's all these other things that they might have missed out on. And there's no research to show at this point that learning from screens is more effective than learning the way that humans have traditionally learned for centuries. If there was research to show that an iPad, helped kids learn faster or, had some other benefit, then that might be an argument for using those more educational apps, so to speak. But at this point, there's not really any research to show that. So everything that an iPad then doesn't offer, the argument is clearly in favor of more traditional learning.
So does research happen to show if there is an uptick in cases of ADD for children over the last several years since screens have started to be introduced?
I'm not aware of any research that specifically looked at that. There have, over a period of maybe a couple decades, there have been increasing rates of ADHD diagnosed. I'm aware of one research study that looked at screen time and the associated attention disorders. It was a correlational study. Hours of screen time associated with rates of attentional disorders. So not looking longitudinally, but just kind of a snapshot. And they controlled for pre-existing, attention difficulties. And there was an association between more hours of screen time and higher rates of attention disorders. However, again, that's correlational. So, I think there's still a lot to be learned in that area.
All right. So we have a couple questions from Carter. She's asking, is there a certain amount of time you should give yourself between using a screen and going to sleep so as not to mess with the quality of your sleep?
Mm-hmm. So we talked about, in general, I recommend about 2 hours. The more time you can give yourself, the better, essentially.
And her second question was, if you spend a lot of your workday on a laptop, would you recommend wearing glasses that filter out blue light?
That's a good question. I didn't know there were such glasses, but if there are, if those have been supported by research to really filter out that blue light, that could be something that could benefit you.
All right. Well, with that, I think we've answered all the questions now, and we're kind of in the last couple minutes of our chat. Is there anything that you would like to mention that I might have not asked you?
I'll just say one example that I give parents a lot is, I find that a common situation that comes up is parents are looking for a solution to keep their kids occupied in the car, running errands, whatever. And what I'll explain to parents is, an iPad versus a kid sitting in a car complaining of being bored. Well, there's actually a lot of benefits to a kid just sitting in a car. They're observing the world around them. They have the opportunity to ask questions about the world. If there's a sibling, there's opportunities for social engagement, emotional regulation practice, regulation of boredom and attention as well. So even something as simple as a child riding in a car to the grocery store can be a really important developmental experience for the child. So in terms of, having a child in that environment versus handing them an iPad in that environment, I would say hold off as long as possible. And that's in general, the message for parents of young children, hold off as long as possible. Screens are inevitable, but the longer you can hold off, the more chance your child will have to develop outside of that screen world.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. It was such good information, so much I didn't already know. So we really appreciate it. And this chat will be available on YouTube and Facebook later, so make sure to watch it if you weren't able to watch the whole thing or if you have someone to share it with. Thank you.